Sarah Matthews sat in her wheelchair by the living room window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the blanket covering her legs, a common symptom of her multiple sclerosis that she had learned to live with over the past 5 years. At 35, she wasn't what most people expected when they thought of someone with MS, but life rarely followed expectations. The sound of teenage laughter drifted in from the kitchen, where her 15-year-old daughter Emma was FaceTiming with her best friend while doing homework. The familiar noise brought a smile to Sarah's face. Despite everything life had thrown at them, they had built a peaceful life here in Cedar Grove, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. Their modest one-story house sat at the end of Oak Street, backing up to an industrial area that had seen better days. Most of the warehouses stood empty now, victims of the economic downturn that had hit their town hard 5 years ago. Sarah had chosen this location deliberately. The house was affordable, and more importantly, it had already been modified for wheelchair accessibility by its previous owner. That evening, as Sarah prepared to move away from the window, something caught her eye. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the abandoned warehouse across the street. This wouldn't have been unusual during business hours, but it was nearly 9 p.m., and the warehouse had been empty for years. She watched as two men in dark clothing stepped out, looking around nervously before opening the warehouse's side door with a key. "That's strange," Sarah muttered to herself, reaching for her phone. She opened her camera app and zoomed in, managing to capture a few clear photos despite her slightly shaking hands. Living with a disability had taught her to be observant. When you couldn't always rely on your body, you learned to pay attention to details others might miss. 20 minutes later, another vehicle arrived, this time a large white van with no markings. Sarah's heart beat faster as she watched three more men unload several large boxes, quickly carrying them into the warehouse. Something about their hurried movements and furtive glances set off alarm bells in her mind. "Mom?" Emma's voice made her jump. "Are you okay? You've been sitting there for ages." Sarah turned her wheelchair around, trying to keep her voice casual. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just watching some suspicious activity at the old Wilson warehouse. Probably nothing." Emma walked over to the window, her long brown hair tied up in a messy bun, homework forgotten. "You mean the creepy one that's been empty forever? Dad always said that place would attract trouble eventually." Sarah felt a familiar pang at the mention of Emma's father, who had walked out shortly after Sarah's diagnosis. But she pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the present. "Could you hand me my notebook from the desk? I want to write down what I just saw." As a former IT specialist, Sarah had always been systematic about documentation. She noted the time, descriptions of the vehicles, and approximate number of people she'd observed. She also backed up the photos she'd taken to her secure cloud storage, another habit from her IT days. The next morning, Sarah called the local police department to report what she'd seen. The dispatcher seemed disinterested, saying they'd look into it, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next few days, she noticed more late-night activities. Different vehicles, more unmarked boxes, always the same furtive behavior. What Sarah couldn't know, was that her simple act of watchfulness had already set larger events in motion. In his office at the Cedar Grove Sheriff's Department, Sheriff James Cooper was looking at a report from one of his deputies about a nosy disabled woman asking questions about the Wilson warehouse. His weathered face darkened as he read the details, and he reached for his phone to make a call. "We might have a problem," he said when the line connected. "Someone's been watching the warehouse." "Yeah, some handicapped lady on Oak Street. Don't worry, I'll take care of it personally." The wheels of a wheelchair weren't the only thing starting to turn in Cedar Grove. As Sarah continued her quiet observation from her window that evening, she had no idea that she was about to become entangled in something much bigger and more dangerous than she could have imagined. 3 days after Sarah's call to the police, she noticed something different during her morning routine. As she wheeled down her ramp to get the mail, a patrol car drove slowly past her house. The officer inside stared at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She tried to wave politely, but he didn't wave back. That afternoon, while Emma was at school, Sarah received her first warning sign. A police cruiser pulled her over on her way back from physical therapy. The young officer claimed she had run a stop sign, something Sarah knew wasn't true. She always drove with extra care, using her specially modified car controls. Ma'am, I'm going to let you off with a warning this time, the officer said, his voice carrying a hint of threat. But you should be more careful. Sheriff Cooper takes traffic violations very seriously in Cedar Grove. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she gripped her steering wheel, and not just from her MS. The mention of Sheriff Cooper's name sent a chill down her spine. She had heard rumors about him since moving to town, but had dismissed them as small-town gossip. The next day, Sarah found a notice taped to her front door. According to the paper, she was in violation of 3 different property codes. Her ramp wasn't up to regulation, her mailbox was 2 inches too low, and her front yard needed immediate maintenance. The fine would be $500 per violation if not corrected within 48 hours. This is ridiculous, Sarah muttered, examining the ramp she had professionally installed just last year. She had all the permits and paperwork filed correctly, she had made sure of that. Emma came home from school looking worried. Mom, is everything okay? My friends said their parents were talking about us at dinner. Something about you causing trouble? Sarah was about to reassure her daughter when a heavy knock interrupted them. Through the window, she could see a tall man in a khaki uniform standing on their porch. Even without the badge, his commanding presence made it clear this was Sheriff James Cooper. Sarah opened the door, conscious of Emma standing nervously behind her wheelchair. The sheriff filled the doorframe, his gray hair neatly trimmed and his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Miss Matthews, he said, removing his hat. I thought it was time we had a chat. Mind if I come in? Sarah wanted to refuse, but she could feel Emma's anxiety. We can talk on the porch, Sheriff Cooper. What can I help you with? The sheriff's smile tightened. I understand you've been making some calls about the old Wilson warehouse. Even taking pictures, I hear. I reported suspicious activity, Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady. Isn't that what responsible citizens are supposed to do? Cooper leaned down, placing both hands on the arms of her wheelchair. The gesture seemed helpful to anyone watching from the street, but Sarah felt trapped. Listen carefully, Miss Matthews. Cedar Grove is a peaceful town. We don't need troublemakers here, especially ones who can't mind their own business. He straightened up, putting his hat back on. It would be a shame if social services had to investigate whether a disabled single mother could properly care for a teenage daughter. Accidents happen, documentation gets lost, people make mistakes in their reports. He paused, letting the threat sink in. Do we understand each other? Sarah's throat felt dry, but she managed to speak. Perfectly, Sheriff Cooper. As the sheriff walked back to his car, Sarah noticed several neighbors quickly turning away from their windows. The message was clear. She was alone in this. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah sat in front of her computer. Her hands trembled as she created a new encrypted folder and began uploading all her photos and notes about the warehouse. She added the property violation notices, a report about the traffic stop, and a detailed account of the sheriff's visit. I won't be bullied, she whispered to herself, saving everything to a secure cloud drive. Not again, not by anyone. She didn't sleep that night, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. But Sarah Matthews had learned long ago that having a disability didn't make her weak. It had made her stronger, more resourceful, and more determined than ever to stand up for what was right. The morning started like any other. Sarah helped Emma get ready for school, trying to maintain their normal routine despite the growing tension of the past week. As she watched her daughter board the school bus, she didn't know that her life was about to change dramatically. Sarah had a doctor's appointment that afternoon. She carefully drove her modified vehicle, following every traffic rule perfectly. On her way home, red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Her heart sank as she pulled over, recognizing the patrol car from previous encounters. This time, 2 deputies approached her car, one on each side. The first deputy, whose nameplate read Wilson, spoke through her window. Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. I need my wheelchair, Sarah explained, trying to keep her voice steady. It's in the back. We'll get it for you, Wilson replied, his tone cold. But first, we need you to submit to a vehicle search. We received an anonymous tip about illegal substances. Sarah's mind raced. I don't consent to a search, she said firmly, remembering her rights. You have no probable cause. The second deputy leaned closer. Ma'am, your car was swerving. That's probable cause. Now are you going to cooperate, or do we need to do this the hard way? Sarah knew she hadn't been swerving. Her hand controls made that impossible. But she also knew arguing would only make things worse. She watched helplessly as they searched her car, noticing how the deputies kept their bodies between her and what they were doing near the passenger side. Well, Wilson announced loudly. What do we have here? He held up a small plastic bag containing white powder. Sarah's blood ran cold. She had never seen that bag before in her life. Within minutes, more patrol cars arrived. News of a disabled mother caught with drugs spread through Cedar Grove like wildfire. Sarah sat in her wheelchair beside her car, humiliated as passing cars slowed to stare. She could see people taking pictures with their phones. At the police station, Sarah called the only person she could think of, her neighbor Mrs. Chen, asking her to pick up Emma from school. Then she was fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell that wasn't wheelchair accessible. They left her chair just out of reach, forcing her to stay on the uncomfortable bench. Quite a fall from grace, Sheriff Cooper said, appearing outside her cell. He stood there, thumbs hooked in his belt, looking satisfied. A concerned citizen reported you. Said they'd seen suspicious activities at your house. We take drug crimes very seriously in Cedar Grove. Sarah met his gaze. You planted those drugs, she said quietly. We both know it. Cooper's smile didn't waver. A judge might disagree, especially when they hear about your prescription pain medications. Makes for a compelling story. Disabled mother gets addicted, starts stealing to support her habit. Child services will have to get involved, of course. Sarah's voice shook with anger. My daughter needs me. Should have thought about that before you started poking around in things that don't concern you, Cooper replied. But I'm a reasonable man. Plead guilty to possession, sign a statement that you made up those stories about the warehouse, and maybe, just maybe, we can work something out about custody. After Cooper left, Sarah sat alone in her cell, her legs cramping without her ability to move properly. But her mind was working overtime. She remembered her security cameras at home, the ones she had installed after the sheriff's threatening visit. They covered her driveway and car. If the deputies had planted evidence, she might have proof. The thought gave her strength. When a public defender finally arrived hours later, Sarah was ready. She hadn't cried, hadn't broken down, hadn't given Cooper the satisfaction. Instead, she had spent those hours remembering every detail, every violation of procedure, every moment that could help prove her innocence. I need to file a formal complaint, she told the public defender, and I need to get access to my home security footage before it mysteriously disappears. The young lawyer looked skeptical but nodded. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the moment Sarah's fight for justice truly began. Lisa Martinez was not what Sarah expected in a public defender. The young lawyer walked into the jail's meeting room carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing a determined expression that made her seem older than her 30 years. She pulled out a chair and sat directly across from Sarah's wheelchair, making eye contact instead of looking away like most people did. Ms. Matthews, Lisa said, opening her laptop. I've reviewed your case file, and several things don't add up. First, let's talk about why a woman with no criminal record and a spotless driving history would suddenly be caught with drugs. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since her arrest. They planted them. The sheriff is trying to stop me from. Don't tell me yet, Lisa interrupted, holding up her hand. She pulled out a small device and placed it on the table. White noise generator. Now we can talk freely. I've had cases involving Sheriff Cooper before, and let's just say I've learned to be careful. For the next hour, Sarah told her story. She explained about the warehouse, the harassment, and the security cameras at her house. Lisa took detailed notes, her frown deepening with each new detail. Have you been able to check on Emma? Sarah asked when she finished. Your neighbor, Mrs. Chen, has temporary guardianship, Lisa replied. She's keeping Emma away from reporters. The local paper ran a pretty nasty story this morning. Sarah's hands gripped her armrests tightly. They're trying to destroy my reputation. Classic Cooper tactic, Lisa nodded. But he made mistakes this time. The deputies didn't wait for a drug dog, didn't have real probable cause, and didn't accommodate your disability during arrest. Plus, if we can get that security footage. A knock interrupted them. A guard entered, saying their time was up. As Lisa packed her briefcase, she leaned close to Sarah. "Trust me," she whispered. "You're not the first person Cooper has tried to frame, but you might be the one who finally brings him down." That evening, Lisa drove to Sarah's house. Mrs. Chen let her in, leading her to Emma, who sat at the kitchen table doing homework. Sarah sat at her home computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard despite their occasional tremors. After 3 days in jail, she was finally home, though under strict conditions. An ankle monitor ensured she wouldn't leave Cedar Grove, but that didn't matter. Everything she needed was right here in her digital files. "Mom, I brought you some tea," Emma said, placing a steaming mug next to her mother's keyboard. Dark circles under Emma's eyes showed the strain of the past week, but she managed a small smile. "Mrs. Chen taught me how to make it just like you like it." Sarah paused her work to squeeze her daughter's hand. "Thank you, sweetheart. And thank you for being so brave through all this." Lisa Martinez sat on the other side of Sarah's desk, reviewing financial documents on her laptop. The young lawyer had practically moved into their home office, working late into each night. Empty takeout containers and coffee cups littered any surface not covered by papers. "Sarah, look at this," Lisa said, turning her screen. "I found something interesting in the county budget records. Large equipment purchases for the sheriff's department, but nothing new in their The week before the trial, the pressure became almost unbearable. Sarah woke one morning to find all 4 tires of her wheelchair-accessible van slashed. The next day, Emma's locker at school was vandalized, cruel words spray-painted across it. But it was the third incident that frightened Sarah the most. Mrs. Chen appeared at their door late one evening, trembling. "Someone broke into my house," she said as Sarah wheeled back to let her in. "They didn't take anything, but they left this on my kitchen table." She held out a photograph of her grandchildren at their school in California, with a simple message written across it: "Stay out of it." Sarah felt sick. "This has to stop. You've done so much for us already. Maybe you should visit your family for a while." "No," Mrs. Chen said firmly, sitting down at the kitchen table. "My husband taught for 30 years in China. He lost his job for speaking up against corruption. I will not run away now." Lisa arrived an hour later, adding the incident to their growing file of intimidation tactics. The young lawyer looked exhausted but determined. "They're getting desperate," she said. "Deputy Reynolds called. Cooper's trying to force everyone in the department to sign sworn statements about your drug-dealing activities." "How many signed?" Sarah asked, adjusting her position in her wheelchair to ease her cramping muscles. "That's the interesting part." Lisa smiled. "Only half. The others suddenly called in sick or took vacation days. Some are finally ready to talk." Emma came downstairs in her pajamas, unable to sleep again. She'd been having nightmares since Sarah's arrest. "I heard voices. Is everything okay?" Sarah reached out to hug her daughter. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Mrs. Chen is just visiting." But Emma wasn't so easily fooled anymore. She looked at the adults' serious faces and squared her shoulders. What did they do this time? Before anyone could answer, Sarah's computer chimed with an incoming email. Her eyes widened as she read it. "It's from the county department. They're responding to our records request about the warehouse security footage. They say all files were accidentally deleted during routine server maintenance." Lisa swore under her breath, then quickly apologized to Emma. "How convenient. When did this accident happen?" "Yesterday," Sarah replied, already typing. "But they made a mistake. Look at the metadata they attached. The deletion wasn't accidental. It was a scheduled task. Someone programmed it specifically." She worked quickly, her background proving invaluable once again. "They tried to cover their tracks, but they don't know systems like I do. I can prove the deletion was deliberate. And I bet if we subpoena the right backup servers." A loud knock at the door made everyone jump. Through the window, they could see 2 patrol cars parked outside, their lights casting ominous red and blue shadows. "Ms. Matthews," a voice called. "This is the sheriff's department. We have a warrant to search the premises for evidence of computer crimes." Lisa quickly pulled out her phone, dialing the judge who had granted Sarah's release. Mrs. Chen hurried Emma upstairs, while Sarah backed her wheelchair away from her computer. "Don't let them touch anything without me present," Lisa instructed, waiting for the judge to answer. "And remember, Everything they do tonight will only help our case tomorrow. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. The past week had shown her just how far Cooper would go to silence her. But it had also shown her how many people were willing to stand beside her. Mrs. Chen with her quiet courage, Deputy Reynolds risking his career, other officers finally finding their conscience, and Lisa working tirelessly despite the threats. As she moved to answer the door, Sarah caught her reflection in the window. She saw what Cooper couldn't understand. Not a helpless disabled woman, but a fighter who had spent years overcoming challenges. Her disability had taught her patience, resourcefulness, and most importantly, how to stand her ground when life got tough. Coming, she called out, her voice steady. Tomorrow would bring the trial, but tonight was just one more battle in her fight for justice, and she was ready. The courthouse buzzed with tension on the first day of the trial. Sarah sat in her wheelchair beside Lisa, aware of every eye in the packed courtroom staring at her. Emma and Mrs. Chen sat directly behind them, while Deputy Reynolds waited nervously in the witness room. Sheriff Cooper sat at the prosecution table, looking confident in his crisp uniform. His lawyer, an expensive-looking man from the city, shuffled papers importantly. The jury filed in, and Sarah could read the prejudice on some of their faces. They'd all seen the newspaper stories painting her as a drug-dealing mother. The prosecutor opened dramatically. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is simple. A disabled woman, bitter about her condition, turned to dealing drugs. When caught, she invented wild stories about police corruption to save herself. Sarah felt her hands trembling but kept her head high. Lisa had prepared her for this. Then it was Lisa's turn. The young lawyer stood, her voice clear and strong. This case isn't about drugs. It's about a brave woman who witnessed corruption and refused to be silenced. By the end of this trial, you'll see the real crime here, a sheriff who abused his power to frame an innocent mother. The prosecution presented their evidence first. The deputies testified about finding drugs in Sarah's car, each story perfectly matching the others. Too perfectly, as Lisa would later point out. They brought up Sarah's prescription medications, trying to paint her as an addict. But Lisa was ready. During cross-examination, she had each deputy admit they hadn't called for a drug dog, hadn't properly documented the search, and hadn't accommodated Sarah's disability during arrest. Their perfect stories began showing cracks. Then came the prosecution's mistake. They called a computer expert to testify about the accidentally deleted warehouse security footage. Lisa's eyes lit up as she approached for cross-examination. "Sir," she began, "are you familiar with metadata timestamps?" The expert shifted uncomfortably. Of course. Lisa displayed Sarah's technical analysis on the courtroom screen. "Can you explain why the deletion command was programmed 2 days before the files were supposedly lost accidentally?" The expert stumbled, looked at Cooper, then admitted he couldn't explain it. The jury sat up straighter, several taking notes. Sarah's heart pounded as Lisa called their witnesses. Mrs. Chen testified about the threats. Other community members described similar intimidation over the years, but the real shock came when Deputy Reynolds took the stand. "Sheriff Cooper ordered us to plant evidence in Ms. Matthews' car," he testified, his voice shaking but determined. "It wasn't the first time. There's a whole system. Fake drug charges, property seizures, selling confiscated goods through the warehouse." Cooper's lawyer objected repeatedly, but the evidence was mounting. Lisa displayed Sarah's security footage, showing deputies clearly planting evidence. She presented financial records showing millions in unexplained department purchases. The jury watched it all with growing disbelief. Finally, it was Sarah's turn to testify. Lisa wheeled her to the witness stand, where she faced the jury directly. "I moved to Cedar Grove looking for a peaceful life for my daughter," Sarah began. "I never wanted to uncover corruption. But when I saw something wrong, I couldn't just look away. My disability doesn't make me weak. It taught me to fight harder for what's right." During cross-examination, Cooper's lawyer tried to rattle her. "Isn't it true you're just bitter about your condition? Angry at authority? Making up stories for attention?" Sarah stayed calm, remembering Lisa's advice. "No, I'm a mother protecting my daughter, a citizen defending my community, and a witness telling the truth." As she returned to her place beside Lisa, Sarah noticed something had changed in the courtroom. The jury was looking at her differently now, with respect instead of pity or suspicion. Even some of Cooper's supporters seemed uncertain. The prosecutor's closing argument felt weak, full of attacks on Sarah's character but light on real evidence. When Lisa stood for her closing, the courtroom fell completely silent. "The evidence is clear," Lisa began. "You've seen the footage, heard the witnesses, followed the money. This isn't about a disabled mother dealing drugs. It's about corruption, power, and the courage it takes to stand up against it. The real question is, will you stand with her?" The jury took less than 2 hours to reach their verdict. Sarah sat quietly in her wheelchair, Emma's hand gripping hers tightly as they waited. The courtroom was packed. It seemed like all of Cedar Grove had come to hear the decision. Even reporters from bigger cities filled the back rows, drawn by the story of corruption in a small town. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The jury foreman stood, holding a single piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor." Sarah felt time slow down as the foreman read the words that would change everything. "On all counts, we find the defendant, Sarah Matthews, not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Emma threw her arms around her mother, crying happy tears. Mrs. Chen dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while Lisa hugged them both. But it wasn't over yet. The judge raised his hand for silence. "In light of the evidence presented during this trial, I am ordering an immediate investigation into the Cedar Grove Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Cooper, please approach the bench." Cooper's face had turned ashen as federal marshals entered the courtroom. His expensive lawyer was already backing away, gathering his papers quickly. "James Cooper," the lead marshal announced, "you are under arrest for corruption, evidence tampering, abuse of power, and conspiracy to violate civil rights." As they led Cooper away in handcuffs, Sarah noticed something remarkable. Many of his former supporters in the audience were taking off their "Support Our Sheriff" pins, looking ashamed. The wall of silence that had protected him for so long was finally crumbling. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded them. "Ms. Matthews, how does it feel to be vindicated?" Sarah looked at Lisa, who nodded encouragingly. "This isn't just about my vindication," Sarah said into the microphones. "It's about every person who was wrongly accused, every piece of property wrongly seized, every citizen who felt powerless against corruption. Today shows that justice is possible, even when the odds seem stacked against you." The next few weeks brought massive changes to Cedar Grove. State investigators took over the sheriff's department, uncovering even more corruption than Sarah had found. The warehouse contained millions in stolen goods and evidence from dozens of falsified cases. Other victims started coming forward, their stories eerily similar to Sarah's. 1 month after the verdict, Sarah sat in her home office, looking at her computer screen with satisfaction. She had just launched a new website, Citizens for Police Accountability, a resource for others fighting corruption in their communities. Her skills were finally being used to help others stand up for justice. Emma came in, waving a paper excitedly. "Mom, I got an A on my essay about moral courage. The teacher wants me to read it at the school assembly." Sarah smiled proudly. Her daughter had grown stronger through their ordeal, learning lessons about justice and perseverance that no textbook could teach. A knock at the door revealed Lisa, carrying a thick manila envelope. "The settlement papers," she announced. The county agreed to everything: compensation for false arrest, funding for police oversight programs, and a formal apology. "And the disability accessibility requirements?" Sarah asked. "All approved. They're renovating every public building to proper standards. Your case changed more than just the police department." Mrs. Chen arrived later with dinner, as she often did now. They had become a real family through their struggles: the brave neighbor, the dedicated lawyer, the strong-willed teenager, and the mother who refused to be silenced. As they ate together, Deputy Reynolds, now Acting Sheriff Reynolds, stopped by with news. "The federal investigation is expanding to 3 other counties. Cooper's network was bigger than anyone imagined." "You started something important, Sarah." Sarah looked around at her extended family, feeling grateful and proud. Her wheelchair sat by the table, no longer a symbol of limitation but of strength. Her disability hadn't stopped her from fighting for justice. In many ways, it had made her fight harder, smarter, and more effectively. "What happens next?" Emma asked, passing the salad. Sarah smiled. "We keep working. There are more people who need help, more wrongs to right." This wasn't the end of something, it was just the beginning. Outside, the sun was setting on Cedar Grove, a town forever changed by one woman's courage to stand up against corruption, proving that justice could prevail even in the darkest of circumstances.